Brian's been the Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division and my partner in crime for now almost the last 2 years. We were also partners in crime in prior administrations and with prior Attorney Generals. So it's been a great pleasure for me to work together with him and with all the fantastic work that the Criminal Division has doing in partnership with the U.S. attorneys around the country on the threats we've been hearing about. So thanks very much, Brian.
Thank you, John. It's been a pleasure to be your partner in crime as well, and thank you for your leadership on this. And for all of you, thank you for joining us for our first panel this morning on the China Initiative. As you've heard, the department launched this initiative in November of 2018 under the leadership of then Attorney General Jeff Sessions, and it has been carried forward with great vigor and intensity under Attorney General Barr's leadership as well. And the Criminal Division has been proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with our partners in NSD, as well as our partners in the United States Attorney's offices around the country. And we have a great panel of very distinguished United States attorneys from around the country. Today, I dare say there aren't 4 more accomplished United States attorneys in the country than the 4 you all have in front of you here today. Let me briefly introduce all 4, although they don't need much introduction, and I'm not going to go into their bio so that we can get into the details quickly. But immediately to my right is Andrew Lelling, the United States Attorney for the District of Massachusetts. Next to him is Jay Town, the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama. Next to Jay is Erin Nealy Cox, the United States Attorney for the Northern District of Texas. And at the end is Rich Donoghue, the United States Attorney for the Eastern District of New York. All 4 of these United States attorneys have been key players in the China Initiative. And I wanted to give each of them an opportunity to give you all a summary of what their districts have been doing to date to achieve the primary goals of this important initiative. And we'll do this a little bit out of order. We'll go ladies first and let Erin start.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that, Brian. Thanks for having us here. So just to talk with you a little bit about what we're doing, I mean, as U.S. attorneys, we were certainly charged by Attorney General Sessions at the time to start working on these cases with our counterparts in the Criminal Division and the National Security Division, and to really partner very cohesively and effectively with the FBI on the investigations and in the counterintelligence realm. In addition to that, I would say in particular in my district and elsewhere across the Southwest, we have been partnering with academic institutions and universities as well as corporate America to conduct talks and sessions in big cities and in small cities, just to talk about the threat as we're seeing it, which is something that the department hasn't been as much out front on until the China Initiative was launched, and to really work with them to make them more aware of the problem, which I think awareness, although simple as a concept, is a really important factor coming out of the China Initiative.
Andy.
Excuse my coughing. Good morning. I'm the U.S. Attorney in Boston, and so in Boston we have a high concentration of both academic institutions and sort of biotech startup type activity. So the China Initiative was very important to us from an enforcement perspective up there, and we've sort of conceived of this as proceeding on 2 tracks, which is, as Erin noted, the outreach side and then the enforcement side. And these 2 complement each other, meaning what we have found is that we do a tremendous amount of outreach to major academic institutions up there. We have Harvard, MIT, Boston University, others. And it won't surprise any of you that there's something of a cultural divide between academia and law enforcement. And so convincing academic institutions that there really is a problem has sometimes been difficult. The enforcement side helps us. Actually doing cases where you are publicly announcing charges and you're prepared to prove them helps you convince the relevant organizations or schools that this really is an issue. And we have found over time we've been able to generate momentum this way. And so it's important to us to do the cases, unearth this kind of activity, prosecute it, have a deterrent effect. It's more important to us ultimately on the outreach side to convince the schools to do take their own internal steps to look at this issue, sensitize them to the problem, so that going forward, they educate their own staff, they're sensitized to the issue, and so we don't have to do as many of these cases in the future.
Jay?
So the 5 U.S. attorneys that are on the China initiative, Boston, Dallas, New York, San Francisco, Silicon Valley, your economic sectors of the United States, insurance industries, oil, energy, and then there's a guy from Alabama, right? Naturally, you would insert someone from the great state, and but what you don't know is that all around this country, you get out of your major population centers, and there is a great deal of R&D and development going on at universities in the private sector. Huntsville, Alabama, which is where I live, is in the Northern District of Alabama. It has every Fortune 100 aerospace company you can think of inside of Huntsville, working on R&D, working on our national defense systems, our propulsion systems to get to Mars, to get to the moon, to launch drones and Hellfire missiles at folks. I mean, we do all of that in Huntsville, Alabama. We have NASA. And so it's important, and it's one of the reasons why I was asked to be on this initiative, is because it does sort of exemplify that perfect soybean is being developed in Iowa, or that thing is being developed in New Mexico or in Montana. And so it's important in our outreach, it's important when we're talking to universities and to the private sector, that we all understand that we all have a great deal of proprietary information in our districts, in our cities, in our states. It's not just in those population centers. And the point of that is that the targets then for the PRC are not just in our big cities, they're everywhere. And so that's been part of our outreach. That's one of the things I've been working on a great deal with this initiative, and it's great to be with my colleagues here today and with you too, Brian.
Thanks, Jay. Rich?
Okay, so similar to our colleagues, we in the Eastern District of New York are primarily taking a two-pronged approach to the China initiative. First is we're continuing and greatly expanding our traditional investigations and criminal prosecutions. And with regard to any of the pending cases, obviously I would adopt Adam's caveat about pending cases and the limitations and the caveats to keep in mind. But we have, for instance, a Huawei case, not the one that Adam mentioned. The case he had mentioned is the Western District of Washington, Seattle case, which is incredibly important and is a good example of IP theft prosecution. We have a related Huawei case in the Eastern District of New York dealing with a variety of things, including bank fraud, relating underlying to sanctions violations. And then we have things like Aventura, a case we announced recently, which relates to supply chain security and cameras that were actually being manufactured in the PRC, mislabeled, manufactured in the United States, shipped to New York, and then sold to the government, including some very sensitive installations within DOD and Department of Energy. So that's sort of a reverse example of some of the things that we focus on. Instead of them taking IP and bringing it to China, we see them bringing technology from China and then weaving it into our infrastructure to give them insight and advantage. We have other cases. I think Lelling was one of the cases mentioned as well, the handler at JFK who was putting packages on commercial aircraft, circumventing TSA and other procedures. So we see a variety of criminal cases across the spectrum that we're prosecuting and our colleagues are prosecuting in the U.S. Attorney's offices. We also have a significant amount of outreach through InfraGard as well as DSAC, the Domestic Security Alliance Council. We do that in conjunction with the FBI. I spent 6 years in a technology company before I had the opportunity to return to the U.S. Attorney's Office, and I see the importance of that to those companies and academic institutions to have some insight into what is actually going on here so they can assess the risk that they are taking. So a lot of things going on, and I think going forward, our efforts and the efforts across the department will only expand.
Rich, let me stay with you for a minute here. The initiative's top priority clearly is to prosecute economic espionage cases when and where we find them. Can you talk a little bit about how the investigation and prosecution of cases under the Economic Espionage Act differ from other types of national security and white-collar crime? And while economic espionage is, of course, the focus, there are other tools that we have in our toolkit. So if you can talk a little bit about both of those.
Sure. So we have a lot of national security matters, investigations, et cetera, in the Eastern District of New York. We've had them for a long period of time, as all our colleagues do. I think this differs from those more traditional national security cases because the threat is not imminent in the same way, and it's therefore not as obvious, right? So if you take a more traditional national security case that we work, say a terrorist cell is planning an attack in New York, everyone understands very quickly what that threat is and how to respond to it, and you understand how the players fit into perhaps a larger plan or conspiracy, and you're able to react to that. So you see kind of the whole threat at one point in time, and you're able to react to that. Here, because the threat is very different and very incremental, you don't necessarily focus on it and how it fits into a bigger picture. And I think that's why AG Sessions really came forward with the China Initiative in November of 2018 to get us as a department to look more broadly at the threat and to understand what's actually going in to these efforts over decades, right? You'd heard about China 2025, the importance of the 100-year anniversary that's going to come up in 2049, and China's stated goals over these milestones. And so it does differ from national security cases in that way. In terms of white-collar cases, many of which are very significant and sophisticated and complex, the white-collar cases, you can usually follow the money. So there is a trail there to be followed, and then you understand the scope of the conspiracy and the scope of the criminal conduct. Here, very often, the perpetrators are taking things that are much more valuable than money. They're taking software code or perhaps hardware that they then use to dominate markets going forward. So while there's a lot of money at stake, and we've heard about some of the estimates, $600 billion a year, it's not as easy to follow that because there's not necessarily a money trail when someone puts software code on a thumb drive and walks it out of a company. So it is different from the white-collar cases in that regard, and it is more challenging. I would say the broad nature of the threat also creates challenges but also opportunities. We see PRC coming up in things like the opioid epidemic, because so much fentanyl is manufactured in the PRC, and they have done some things recently to help with that in terms of scheduling. But you see this threat manifest across the spectrum of the office's cases and investigations, and I know that's the same for all our colleagues.
Andrew, thank you, Rich. Andrew, your office, very high-profile case, just last week charged a trio of China-related cases, one of which, as folks have noted here today, involved a senior professor at Harvard. Can you describe what these soft power influence efforts look like on college campuses today, given the cluster of universities that you have in Boston? And what should academic institutions be on the lookout for, and how can they protect themselves from this kind of conduct?
Sure. First, these three cases last week, I think, illustrate a point that both Director Wray and AAG Demers made, which is the scope of the problem. So we charged three cases last week, one involving Professor Charles Lieber at Harvard, who's the chair of the chemistry department at Harvard and a pioneer in nanotechnology, which is not an irrelevant detail to his dealings with the Chinese. And he is not a Chinese national, nor is he of Chinese descent. The second case involved a cancer researcher at a major hospital in Boston, was a Chinese national, stealing cancer research from that hospital, taking it back to China. The third, what we would call a traditional intelligence collector as opposed to a non-traditional one, was a woman employed at Boston University in polymer studies as a researcher who happened to also be a lieutenant in the People's Liberation Army, but allegedly managed to leave that off of her visa application and her paperwork with BU. And so these three cases, which are sort of three different flavors, give you a sense of how broad a spectrum there is in this area. Of these three cases, the Lieber case, I think, got the most attention and caused a certain amount of consternation in the academic community. And essentially, the allegation against Dr. Lieber is that he had been recruited by the Thousand Talents program, a program sponsored by the Chinese government, which is kind of brilliant in its simplicity. And what it essentially does is attempts to induce researchers in the United States, whether they are Chinese nationals or whether they are not, to work with the Chinese and so instigate a flow of technology and know-how from the United States to China. So Dr. Lieber was recruited by Wuhan University of Technology and then recruited by the Thousand Talents program. And what we've alleged is that he was being paid $50,000 a month to work with the Chinese and essentially transfer to them his know-how on nanotechnology on the atomic level, which is obviously a cutting-edge science. The core of the allegation against him is that he lied about this to federal authorities, including investigators from NIH and DOD, when they asked him about it. And that is a crime. And so in light of that case, a lot of questions we've gotten revolve around, well, is it illegal for academics in the United States to collaborate with their counterparts in foreign countries? And the answer to that is no. And again, this has caused some confusion because while that is allowed, lying about that activity to federal authorities when you're required not to is not allowed. And so the upshot here is that on university campuses, what we have seen is that cases like this have generated a need for better guidelines for academia. Even the members of academia who are not opposed to this form of enforcement ask not unreasonably, okay, well going forward, how do we avoid this problem? And that's a lot of the outreach that I've been doing in the last few months and now on an accelerated basis since we charged Dr. Lieber. And so there are a few answers to this question. One, the primary goal of the China Initiative is to sensitize private industry and academic institutions to this problem. That's 80% of the battle. So if the administration at Harvard or whatever other major university institution we're talking about is aware of this issue and is disseminating that concern to its faculty, right there you've done a lot to deter this issue in the future. Maybe next time an academic does not lie about his connections to a Chinese program, or maybe next time an academic at that institution thinks twice or thinks a little bit harder about their collaboration with a Chinese institution and what the motivations of the Chinese institution might be. That's most of it. Beyond that, on the more nuts and bolts level, it'll ultimately be up to the institutions to develop their own internal controls for keeping track of, if they choose to do this, what their faculty are doing on Chinese projects. Now, some will complain that this might have a chilling effect on collaboration with the Chinese. The answer to that is, for good and bad reasons, yes, it will. We are in the midst of a situation in which China has launched a massive nationwide effort to pilfer U.S. technology and know-how and transfer it to China for its own uses. And so, unfortunately, this kind of response is needed. But to your point about other soft power influences, another aspect of the problem, and one that Director Wray touched on, is the Chinese government's very determined effort to control discussion of China on U.S. college campuses and increasingly even in K through 12 education in U.S. schools. So there are Confucius Institutes on many U.S. campuses, which are Chinese-funded, sort of Chinese cultural centers. And the people who work there are under extremely strict controls about what they can and cannot say about the Chinese government. More concerning to us, and we have leads on these kinds of cases in Boston, is agents of the Chinese government, and I mean literally agents of the Chinese government, come to the United States to exercise sort of ideological control over Chinese nationals who may be operating completely in good faith, who are here to study, to learn at our schools or work at our institutions. And we have seen indications of Chinese agents coming to the United States to cajole or intimidate other Chinese nationals who are here to make sure that their targets do not say negative things about the Chinese government and in fact only say positive things about the Chinese government. And so what you see is the Chinese government taking advantage of the openness of U.S. society to make this kind of propaganda headway on our own soil. which is extremely concerning and has led us to try and think of creative ways to, frankly, prosecute some of these people who have come over here with that intention in mind. So with that, I'll pass it back to you.
Thanks, Andrew. Jay, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, you and your office have been active in conducting outreach to industries and institutions, companies that are potential targets. What have you seen in terms of the challenges that we face in getting our message out to universities and companies in Alabama? What's working and where have we faced headwinds?
Well, one of the things that we identified early on, the China Initiative, is that it was important that we develop sort of a suite of things for all the U.S. Attorney community, all 93 of us, to be able to go out into our universities and private sectors and give some sort of overview of the threat that the PRC poses to their district. Every district's a little bit different, but every district probably has a military base, has a university of some sort, and some sort of economic sector. And so, and the technology that drives that sector. And so we developed not only, PowerPoint presentations, you've seen a lot of those slides today already, but also the talking points and making sure we get the word out with op-eds, with sort of appearances in the media in one form or another, one platform or another. And so that was important, that it wasn't just the four of us, but the five of us, AAG, Benczkowski, and Demers. It can't just be us doing all of the lift. The whole of government approach has to include all of our United States attorneys. Of course, General Barr and General Sessions have been leading the way on that as well. And I have a friend who is the general counsel at a major pharmaceutical company, and we often sort of quip about how that first pill costs $10 billion to create and manufacture and to be efficacious. The second one costs 2 cents. And the illustration is that the Chinese government only wants to pay 2 cents. And that is sort of the message when you put it in sort of those terms. That is exactly what the China Initiative is countering, but that is also the threat, the national security threat that the PRC is posing to the variety of our economic sectors. You saw I think it was the wheel of death that you referred to. It's agriculture, it's IT, it's not just national security and aerospace and the things that we typically think of when we talk about national security. It's every sort of aspect of our economy. And so what we've done is I've gone out and personally, and I know that these folks have too, gone out and done major sort of CEO summits for a multitude of CEOs and CFOs and COOs in my community, both in Birmingham and Huntsville and from around my district. I've done it for university system in my district as well. And then we've done some private outreaches that a company might not want to show up at the big thing and ask a question in front of all the other CEOs, but hey, could you come and sit with my C-suite folks and give us the same briefing? And we're happy to do that. And we usually bring the FBI. We have some intelligence community folks down in Alabama as well, naturally, right? And so we bring them along so that we remind our corporate sector and academia that, frankly, we can keep bigger secrets than there's been some sort of cyber intrusion into your company. And so if you enlist our help and our resources, we can be of great benefit to, one, ensuring that doesn't happen again to you or to others, but two, perhaps getting into the criminal prosecution business that my colleague was just speaking about. And by the way, Andy Lelling has never had a case that wasn't high profile. I've known him for 3 years, and that's pretty much, so yeah.
Thanks, Jay. Erin, as folks have noticed here, these China-related cases arise in a surprisingly wide range of districts. We have, as Jay said, who would have thought we would have northern Alabama here? But what kind of resources are you available? We're grateful that you're here.
It seemed a little.
Jay. No, it was sort of a gee whiz moment, not a why are you here moment. But Erin, what kind of resources are available for your fellow U.S. attorneys to prepare for cases involving Chinese economic aggression? And what do you think we can be doing better to equip our prosecutors to handle these cases?
Well, I think we've really focused on working with our counterparts, the National Security Division, Crim Division, all the U.S. attorneys across the country, like Jay said, the 93 of us, to number one, make sure that we're aware of the research and the counterintelligence out there, and make sure that we have the latest briefings, but also to make sure that we're aware about the enforcement cases that are going on across the country, and to be able to use those cases in some of our outreach efforts. I mean, I think that is something unique that we need to be able to do. We need to be able to point to cases and talk about factual situations that are applicable to companies and to citizens that are in every district. And I think we've really had a good opportunity to do that, collect those cases, talk about them. And there's a great deal of interest across the U.S. attorney community, not only for the enforcement nature of the case, but also in being able to better arm their counterparts and colleagues and big companies and across academia, just to give them sort of some hard factual data so they can be aware of it. It's not, we're certainly not talking about the what ifs, and this could be an engaging in hyperbole. When you hear about some of these cases, there is a distinct and stark realization that what the FBI has been saying for some time now is actually happening in the country, and we're going to be prosecuting it vigorously. So we've been arming them with a lot of good information. Certainly you've seen likely some U.S. attorneys across the country that have written some opinion pieces and gotten those published in papers so that we can effectively talk about it on a larger basis as well. And then, the National Security Division and Crim Division have been working with our offices to give them, speaking materials and intelligence briefings from the FBI, just to be better equipped to talk about the latest things. So I think, we've taken, we certainly, consistent with Director Wray's admonitions, we've taken a whole U.S. attorney community approach to this threat. It's that important to us. It's that significant to us to talk about it and to engage in pretty vigorous prosecution of these cases.
Thanks, Erin. There are a couple of additional questions. I'll throw it open to any of the panelists who have thoughts. One question is, are there additional legislative or regulatory steps that we would recommend and that the United States should consider to allow us to more effectively address these particular issues?
I have one thought on that, which is on the academic side, which my office has been focusing on a lot. I do think it would be in the public interest for grant-making bodies that give a lot of money in academia, DOD, NIH, there are others, to establish their own kinds of guidelines and guidance for the academic community to sort of alleviate some of the concern about not knowing where the navigational buoys are anymore. If you're in academia, there is that feeling. And so I think that would probably be a helpful step for the government to take.
I think that, so we've all heard in this town anyway of the Foreign Agents Registration Act, and that really only applies to political activities as it relates to foreign governments. And with the billions of dollars that we are, as Andy was talking about, granting to academia and investing into R&D in the private sector through DOD and other departments, I do think it would be important to at least have sort of a point one where it does apply to not just political activity, but perhaps would apply to research activity and some other things, and give some real teeth to what the president and what this Justice Department is trying to accomplish with prosecuting these individuals that are taking these grant monies and perhaps using it for nefarious purpose.
Do any of our panelists have any thoughts about what we might do in terms of additional international outreach efforts to strengthen our hand here? Obviously, outreach to China is probably unlikely to serve much in the way of that purpose, but are there other, in your views, things that we can be doing internationally to help with this problem?
Brian, there are a number of things underway already, and they will continue and expand as we go forward. As I indicated earlier, we have one of the Huawei cases currently pending, and that case will continue, but you could do an entire conference on Huawei, right, as an example of how this operates in the real world. But I think that we need to continue to have very frank discussions with our partners around the world about the nature of this threat. I think that is ongoing now. Obviously, almost not a day goes by when you don't look in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, whatever, and see articles about Huawei and consideration and discussions around the world about what role that company should play, particularly as we go forward into a 5G environment. But it's good that we have discussions, and it's good that we are given the opportunity around the issue to discuss what is really going on here. I think that in addition, we should have very frank discussions with China, and we've been very clear with them about our perception of their efforts and how we're going to respond to it, and how we're simply not going to enable their efforts to undermine our national security. So it's important that we have these discussions both with allies and with adversaries around the world, and I think you can see that continue and expand as we go forward.
Several questions from the audience, many of which we won't be able to get to, but I think this is a good one. And based on each of your experience and outreach to the business community in your particular districts, the question from the audience is, what would it take, and what do we think it'll take to get U.S. businesses and their trade associations and others to be willing to step up and speak a little bit more publicly on their own behalf about the threat that they face? There's a perception, at least by the questioner in the audience, but I think it's probably accurate, that many are in the business community are unwilling to speak out and discuss this threat openly because of fears about retribution. But do you have any thoughts about what we might be able to do to encourage that discussion and encourage the business community in particular to acknowledge the threat?
Well, this comes up quite often in the discussions that I've had with those that are C-level executives, as well as, those that are working in important aspects of their businesses. There is a general disinclination to, number one, believe that this is actually going on at the level that it is going on, and two, that they would actually be a target of this kind of state-sponsored economic espionage. That's why it's helpful to have the cases to talk about, ranging from, it's not just obviously technology, telecom industry, or defense industry, it's almost every industry in America. The idea is in any way and in every way that they can gain a competitive advantage, they will. And I do think that the cases make a difference. It's reminiscent of, when we started seeing a lot of cyber intrusions and a lot of media exposure to data breaches, where people weren't thinking they would ever be a victim of a cyber intrusion, and now that's in our common everyday vernacular. I think those cases really exhibit to them, this could be me, and I really need to start paying attention to it. Also, I do think that in our discussions, one thing that may make them more comfortable and has made them more comfortable, the business executive or the employee, is knowing that they do have someone in the FBI who is very sensitive to these things, understands the threats, understands the inclination of the employee to be fearful about retribution, the inclination of the company executive to be fearful of retribution. And we do not approach it in a sort of storm in and take over type situation. We're sensitive to these things. We understand the ramifications, the real world implications of these kind of things. And I think, from my point of view, that really makes a difference when you can walk through specific examples of how the FBI and the United States government has dealt with these things, sometimes very quietly and sometimes very loudly.
Another good question from the audience, and a related question. In your outreach to universities, have you sensed resistance to cooperation, particularly if the university has engaged with Chinese entities, receives funding for their graduate students? Have you felt that resistance, and what have we been doing to try to overcome it?
I'll give you a quick example from Boston. I think that, and I alluded to this earlier, one of the very important aspects of actually bringing cases, of actually putting points on the board, is that when you go and talk to the universities, they're more likely to believe you that there's actually a threat. And so what I've experienced in the Boston area is that initially there is resistance from the universities from the viewpoint of whether they believe there is actually a problem. Once you're able to get them over that hurdle, they're actually quite responsive. And so we've gone to universities and initiated conversations, and their concerns are not unreasonable ones. Their concerns are, are you just being paranoid because you're in federal law enforcement? Is this actually a problem? Are you racial profiling? These are all questions that come up. We deal with them. Once we're able to convince them that this is an existing threat that impacts their campus, then it's fine. Then I have found that the universities are quite responsive, very responsible. They are willing to convey information to us to help us with our investigations. There are things they need on their end, a certain degree of discretion, a certain degree of input in how these things proceed, but I actually have not seen a problem.
Yeah, just to echo what Andy said, I think that's absolutely right. You mentioned earlier there's a bit of a cultural divide between academia and law enforcement, and that's certainly true, but that's an initial reaction. And if you can get past that and explain to them what's really going on, I think they are appreciative and responsive. In a lot of ways, part of the cultural divide is because academia flourishes on collaboration, as it should. And so when you look at technology development and you look at people trying to take advantage of others' technology development, what becomes the weak link here? It's academia. Because people come in and out of labs at universities, they want professors and students to come from other countries, and that's beneficial for everyone. But they don't have the same type of safeguards in place that, say, a technology company would that's invested millions or billions of dollars in this research and has an infrastructure to secure that research. Academia is much more loose in how it secures these things, and that emphasis on collaboration tends to leave them vulnerable. But when you explain the vulnerabilities to them, I think they are very receptive. And I think particularly with regard to the grant process, academia is very interested in this and should be. If you are in an academic institution and you are not thoroughly scrutinizing the grant applications you're putting in and the grant that you've already received, you are committing administrative malpractice. They really need to take the time to look at the representations that they're making to the U.S. government and other grant agencies to ensure that their own personnel, professors and otherwise, are accurately reporting what financial or other support they're receiving from other entities. So they really need to focus on the grants right now, and as we've seen recently with the work in Andy's district and elsewhere, that's an incredibly important component of this effort.
I was told we have until 10. We may have a little bit longer than that. But I wondered if each of you could give us a sense of where we go from here, from your perspective. What do you see on the horizon in each of your offices in the coming year? I imagine you may have similar views about what we're going to do next. But if you guys each want to offer a few thoughts about how you think the initiative will continue to operate and flourish and grow in the next year or so.
I can say from the Boston perspective, my hope is that, my prediction is that these cases will spike at some point and then begin to trail off, hopefully as industry and academia become more sensitized to the problem. I can tell you that for the coming year in Boston, what I anticipate, frankly, is prosecuting more people, which I think will help deter this kind of conduct in the private and academic sectors. And I think we will couple that with outreach. Later in the year, we anticipate doing some kind of national conference on the China issue to sort of try and raise the profile even more and take advantage of the publicity of recent cases in this area. So I think that's what we see in my neck of the woods.
Just like anything else that is incredibly complex and sort of involves sort of a holistic approach for solutions, this situation with the PRC and the China Initiative is no different. And so I think the more that we talk about it, you're all here at CSIS today to hear some wonderful speakers and talk about the issue, but also to engage with us on these panels. So clearly you have the interest as well. I think our goal is to swell audiences and have more audiences like this one so that this does sort of enter our common lexicon when we are talking about not just economy, but also national security, and that it just sort of is repetitive in our national lexicon such that we can continue to have conversations like this 5, 10, 20 years from now. As Rich said earlier, China's goals with their, 2025 and 2049, they're not going to quit just because we've had a successful year prosecuting folks, or we see that spike and it starts to go down. The Chinese are playing a long game, and so we need to match that with our own wits.
Well, and I of course echo those sentiments. The only thing that I would add is really that I see us cooperating with some of our other government agencies such as Commerce and Treasury, and really kind of ramping up a holistic approach from the federal government so that we can address the cases that we already have more effectively and address the threat more effectively from an outreach point of view.
And I think, as Andy said, you will see an increase in prosecutions, not just of individuals, but of companies. And that opens a whole new avenue of discussion, right? Because as with any company prosecution, you can't incarcerate a corporation. And so what's the right result to a company prosecution? You may want to punish them, you may want to deter them, but particularly when you're looking at a threat that's going forward really for decades, the right resolution to those types of criminal prosecutions has to do with mitigating the threat, and it has to address mitigating that threat. So I think you're going to see some very interesting prosecutions coming forward across the department, across the U.S. Attorney community, and I think it will challenge our international relationships and structures and norms, and I think we will get to a period where there will be a new normal that will be based upon a more thorough understanding of what's going on and a more clear-eyed assessment of the interests and conflicting interests of different parties. And I think that is good, because I think the backside of that is that it will actually lessen the chance for conflict going forward, because what has been going on for the last few years, something that I think John Brown noted, we've been late to become aware of, has put us on a road to conflict. And if we address it now, and we address it effectively through prosecutions of individuals, prosecutions of companies, outreach to academia and the technology industry, I think in the long term, that lessens the chance for conflict between the United States and the PRC, and that is actually a good thing for all of us.
We've reached the end of our time. I hope you all appreciate and found this panel informative. These are 4 United States attorneys among many, but certainly 4 of the key leaders in the department who are really at the forefront and the tip of the spear on this initiative. So I want to thank you all for coming in from your various districts around the country to participate here today. I think this was very informative and very helpful. So thank you very much for all that.
Thanks, Brian. Good job, buddy.